In case you didn't get it already, I'm dropping that sign in the chat one more time. So please make sure that you do sign in. In case you are not one of our coaches and you're visiting us today, thank you so much for being here. If you do participate in this PDL, you do get credit for that. So we want to make sure that you're signed in so that you can get that credit. So thank you everybody for being here. My name is Candace Osborne. I'm here with Laura. And we're here today to talk to you guys about how we can support English language learners using the WIDA framework, as well as aligning it with structured literacy practices. So I am a structured literacy coach with the Southwest Regional Educational Cooperative. It's my first year in this role, but I've spent most of my career educating language learners in both dual language, heritage language, and ELD programs. And I spent a few years working as an ELD coach, and I'll let Laura introduce herself too.
I'm Laura Jepson. I also am with Southwest Regional Education Co-op. I have supported English language learners, not only our Spanish speakers, but I had the pleasure of supporting a Korean student, brand new to the United States, but I also have experience as an instructional coach supporting teachers with using the WIDA standards and backwards planning to support our multilingual students. So welcome, and we'll go ahead and get started. We started out with this first graphic here because we all know how difficult it can be to learn a new language. And for our multilingual students, it can be very challenging. But also, it was a good graphic because research has shown that English language learners are overrepresented in the population of poor readers, and they also are over-identified as having a learning disability. And so the data collected by the U.S. Department of Education in 2018 and 2019 showed that approximately 14.1% of students were identified as having a learning disability and receiving services through IDEA Part B. Nationally, 11.3% of the students with disabilities were multilingual, which is a little bit higher than the total percentage of students enrolled as being English learners, which was 10.2%. So it's a little bit over a percent of students were qualified for meeting an IEP that was more than just the general average. So also on the other hand, they find that sometimes students who are multilinguals and do have a learning disability don't never get those services or don't get them as soon as they should. So we're going to talk today about how to use the science of reading to do our best to support multilingual students in their reading development and to best identify those students that need extra support.
We have a few goals for what we'd like to get done today. We want to review what we know about the science of reading. We'd like to discuss what ELD instruction looks like, both historically and in terms of in alignment with the science of reading. We're going to examine the WIDA framework. It is a huge framework that could take a very long time for us to go in depth with. So we're going to kind of skim the surface of that today, but we're hoping it inspires some continued practice and engagement with that. We're going to explore what this means for the implications for instruction for our language learners. We're hoping to take some time to plan for instruction and formulate our next steps. Like, where do we go from here? This is a lot of information that we're going to be talking about. It's a lot for us to try and digest today. So we're going to hopefully come up with some ideas of what else we can do moving on in the future. I noticed a few people still popping in, so I'm going to drop that sign-in sheet in the chat again, just in case you haven't gotten to that yet. Please make sure to sign in. So we're going to actually start by doing a little activity with you guys today. And this is a quick write reflection that we're going to have you do. We're going to have you take about 2 minutes to just think to yourselves. And what we'd like you to do is write a 6-word sentence that shows what you know either about the science of reading about ELD instruction, or ideally something that kind of incorporates both. We're going to do this as a waterfall style activity. So what that means, in case you haven't done a waterfall before, is that I'm going to ask you to type your response in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. Once I say waterfall, that's when we will all press enter and all our responses will come across all at once. So we're going to give you 2 minutes to kind of think about that and come up with your sentence. We did create a little example here for you, and our sentence is: language development supports overall reading success. So we're going to give you 2 minutes, just a little bit of quiet time. Think about what your 6-word sentence would be. And when I say waterfall, we'll all send it out in the chat. Thumbs up if we got that. Awesome. Okay, 2 minutes. We got about 1 more minute. And waterfall. Oh my goodness, so much. Seeing things about explicit instruction, about using ELD instruction to support all of our learners, about how some of these things really, some of our understandings really align with each other, what we know about good ELD practices and the science of reading. Again, explicit instruction.
Instruction supports all our students.
So thank you all for sharing.
Check those baskets at the bottom of the. Oops, I'm sorry.
I thought you were asking us something. So we wanted to share this activity with you guys because we're trying to model some of the practices we can use in our classrooms as well as we're supporting our language learners. So you're going to see throughout our presentation, you'll see these little graphics in the bottom of our slides where we see our little friends who are showing the domains of language that we might be using. The little heart there represents this can also be used as a CLR and SEL activity. We know that we're tasked with trying to combine all of these things, right? We have to be culturally and linguistically responsive. We have to plan for social emotional learning. We have to provide ELD services. We have to meet all the layers of instruction. So we really want to provide some strategies for how we tie that all together. So this is one way that we wanted to show how we could do that. Some things you'll see on this slide that are specifically supportive of our language learners is that you'll see we have bolding of important information. We're using graphics to help guide our thinking here. And then this is actually a strategy that comes from Dr. Mora Flores. If anybody is familiar with her work, it is adaptable all the way. I've seen it used K through 12. But what we focused on here is that 6-word sentence that can really be changed depending on what you know about your learners. But it really, the idea is we're pushing language production. So we want to give a limit in terms of what we're asking people to write, because we don't want responses like, I don't know, or I'm not sure. So when we give that 6-word sentence limit, we're asking our learners to kind of push themselves. So we wanted to share that strategy with you. And I lost my cursor, sorry. Okay, so we're going to very quickly review what we know about the science of reading. I think a lot of us in here already have this background, but it is important when we're talking about instruction for our language learners. And this is what one of our goals here today is how we align this with the science of reading and structured literacy practices. So we wanted to first draw your attention to what we know about the simple view of reading. And we see that we need both the word recognition piece and the language comprehension piece to develop that overall reading comprehension. We don't get to that piece of skilled readers if we don't address both these areas. We think that it's really important to draw attention to this in terms of our language learners, because oftentimes when we have students that come to us that maybe have limited English proficiency, we can get really hung up on the language comprehension piece. We see it as an area of need. We see it as a strong urgency. And so we maybe kind of stick to those areas. And it's important for us to know that we need all these pieces working together. So if we look at our reading rope, we see everything that goes into language comprehension, but we also see those skills that are needed in word recognition. And it's really important, especially for our multilingual learners, that we're addressing all those areas and that we don't let our concern with language be the only thing that drives our instruction. So we kind of want to start with just talking about what is ELD. So if we don't know, ELD stands for English Language Development. This comes from Albuquerque Public Schools definition of what English language development is, specifically their Department of Language and Cultural Equity. But we think that definitions are pretty similar across the board. So this could be a good guide for us in understanding what English language development is. It is a service that is provided to our English language learners. It's typically provided during an English language arts block, and it's meant to develop the domains of language, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. I like to think of it in terms of being specific, targeted instruction for students within language. So I like to say it, but I don't like to say it because we, like Laura was talking about, we don't want to over-identify students and think of them as having disabilities, but oftentimes this is kind of like an IEP where we have individualized plans for our students who are language learners. It's also important to note that a big idea behind English language development is that we recognize that all children come to us with language. One language is not superior to the other. And the idea of ELD is that we leverage the language that children have to help support and scaffold them into learning. There is a push, and we're talking about WIDA today, so we want to make sure we touch on this too. There is a push kind of spearheaded by WIDA that there's a shift from calling our language service programs TESOL into really using this term of English language development, because sometimes when we use the word TESOL, I don't think we always explicitly know this, but it may kind of give us the understanding that like English is more important, or English is the more important language of instruction, whereas ELD comes from a more asset-based approach where, again, we're taking into account all of this language is very important. Also, you'll probably hear us say multi-language learners a lot, which is a push from a difference from using the term ELs or English learners, because we also want to recognize that not all of our students are just learning English, and not all of them are just learning one or two languages. So we need to take into account all of the languages that our students may be coming to us with. So we're just going to do a quick glance over this. We could get really detailed and specific with this, but we're just going to quickly talk about the approaches to language instruction that we have within our state. So within our state, we have 3 programs that are used. We have dual language programs, which probably teach or aim to equitably teach 2 languages. And then we have heritage language programs, which are used to just support and maintain the primary language of the students. And then we have English language development programs where we have multilingual learners who are in English only settings, but we want to, again, use that asset-based approach in instruction with them. At the center of all these programs, though, we just want to draw your attention to the fact that at the center is the realization that all of these aim to support language learners. We might do it in different ways, but we're all focused on how we provide that explicit instruction to language learners. We also just quickly wanted to talk about and draw your attention to the fact that we do have dual language and heritage language programs in our state that are not Spanish speaking programs. So oftentimes we tend to think that when students are in a dual language program, their other language of instruction is Spanish. We also have Indigenous language programs that we have to be aware of. And in terms of that, when we're teaching English language development, we never know what language our students are going to come to us with. We generally tend to think that it's going to be Spanish, and because of the prevalence of Spanish speakers, we are going to go over some examples today of what instruction looks like in terms of working with Spanish-speaking students. But we have to realize that it's not always going to be their primary language is Spanish. Within my career, I've had students who have spoken Turkish, Swahili, ASL is even identified as a primary language other than English. So, we have to understand that it's kind of all encompassing. So what we'd like to do here is kind of take a look at traditionally, what did instruction of multilingual learners look like? And how does that now align to what we know with the science of reading and how we should be providing instruction to multilanguage learners? So typically, when we think of effective ELD instruction, we tend to think of like whole language or balanced literacy instructional approaches. And these oftentimes include things like interactive read alouds, shared reading, reading workshop, writer's workshop, guided reading, and word work. And for me, because this was my background, balanced literacy, whole language is where I came from, and it was really hard for me at first to come to grips with what that meant in terms of this shift into structured literacy and the science of reading, because I felt like I'd been doing everything wrong, and I didn't want to maybe accept that I had been doing everything wrong. And so we wanted to look at it in terms of like, well, what does it really look like? How do we take these practices and really examine them in terms of structured literacy? And so we don't have time to go through all of these, but we do want to recommend the book Shifting the Balance, because it does really go through explicitly how we take what we know about traditional approaches to English language development and shift it into what we know works more appropriately for our multilingual learners. So we're going to take a look at just a few practices, starting with that interactive read aloud. So in terms of a traditional approach to ELD instruction, we would, in both of these, we do have that interactive read aloud. It is something that we want to do. Both of them would pick texts that are language rich. Both of them would aim to build background knowledge, and both of them would have predetermined stops while we're reading that text, where we stop to ask questions. We model how to talk about the text, how to think about the text. We're building in oral language opportunities. For example, that might be like your think, pair, share, turn and talk kind of thing. The difference is when we look at a structured literacy practice, we're moving then into more purposefully selected texts rather than just something that might be high interest to our students. And we're really shifting that focus into stretching the limits of listening comprehension. So we do have to really explicitly think about and plan for what we know about our students, and not just pick a book and read it out loud. And then the other one we wanted to draw focus to today was the traditional guided reading practice, where in a traditional approach to ELD instruction, we would have guided reading. In a structured literacy approach, we have more targeted reading instruction. So we're looking at a difference in leveled groups versus skill-based groups, working off of a cueing system rather than a decoding system, using decoding strategies to read. In a traditional literacy practice for ELD, we might have student-led or independent work. And in a structured literacy practice, we're still probably going to see that, but it's still teacher facilitated. What we don't see is all the behind the scenes of the teacher planning to make sure that those other groups are really doing still that skill-based targeted work. There's a lot of maybe guess and check that happens in a traditional approach, whereas in structured literacy practice, it's that look before you leap. We really want to be looking at the parts of the word. Both of them aim to provide rigorous and engaging content, and both of them do have oral and written language components. The big shift here is where we're trying to provide that explicit instruction and move away from the guessing strategies. And I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Candace. So now we're going to talk about, so just thinking about this, what are the implications for structured literacy, and how do we utilize structured literacy to support our multilingual students? So, of course, as Candace said, teachers can better support multilingual students if they're aware of the nuances in the two languages that the children speak and make formal comparisons between those foundational skills and language structures in English and in the child's first language. So there's resources, as we know, in the back of letters that lay out specific differences in phonemic awareness, phonics, grammar, and Spanish, as well as Vietnamese. There's a few languages there that they lay out the differences to provide support, but there's also reading programs such as Benchmark that go into great detail about that as well. Here today, we're going to focus on the differences between English and Spanish, just because, as Candace said, just generally in the United States, 10% of our students are identified as being multilingual, with 75% of them being Spanish speaking. But of course, here in New Mexico, we know we have a high percentage of Spanish speaking and Native American speaking students. Unfortunately, I spoke with my friend in Indian Studies, and she gave me some little details to support Native American speakers. Most of their languages are oral, and even when you can make comparisons with the language, she said it's very difficult. So of course, the best thing you can do is just be very explicit about that instruction for our Native American students and providing them an opportunity with materials and things that are culturally relevant to be successful for them. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But for our purposes here, to compare the two languages, we'll focus on English and Spanish. So going to phonological awareness, everything is pretty similar with the foundational skills, but some important things to know that are that in English, students spend much more time at the phoneme level, while in Spanish, more time is spent at the syllable level. So in order to help understand their errors and also to support them with making that connection, especially when you're teaching the different syllable types, it's very important to be aware of those differences. So if we take a look at what that looks like, on the next slide, or Candace, do you want to move on to the next slide? Here we can see that in English, you can see what that looks like at the phoneme level, whereas in Spanish, everything is at the syllable level, even when it syllable manipulation, deleting syllables from words, it's all increases quickly, and students learn to read at a much faster pace in Spanish for that reason. So moving on to phonics. Our multilingual students benefit from direct teaching of speech sounds in each language. So if it's a dual language program, it's very important to their development that there's explicit instruction in both English and Spanish. And with English having over 40 phonemes and Spanish having 22 phonemes, there's quite a lot of little differences in the nuances in language that we can be very specific and explicit and point out if this is a letter sound combination that they see in Spanish. And if it is, to make that connection. If it's not, to be very explicit in pointing out the differences in the two languages. Spanish only has 5 vowel sounds compared to our 18 plus the schwa. So there's a lot of differences that need to be explicitly taught to students. And this is where a sound wall comes in really handy, because you can show the differences in the sounds as well as the mouth formation. And this is very helpful in students in mapping out those sounds. Also with phonics, again, with the differences in the syllable types for English, it's critical to explicitly teach those 6 syllable types, because Spanish syllables, they're typically open syllables. And of course, the vowels always make the sound they expect them to. So even initially, when you're starting teaching the difference between closed and open syllables and pointing out those differences between English and Spanish is going to be helpful in those students in mapping those different sound differences. And then gives you an idea of what students at the similar progression, what it would look like in English versus Spanish. So here you see students might be learning and reviewing letter sounds with the individual sounds in English, whereas in Spanish, we see they practice the syllables and then they go on to word reading. And you can see they're already reading multi-syllable words, whereas our English readers are still reading closed syllables. And then high frequency words and reading sentences looks very similar, but of course, again, we see the types of words that our Spanish speaking students would be reading are multisyllabic already at this point. And then moving on to vocabulary, the vocabulary instruction is very similar. You're going to explicitly teach vocabulary words in each language with a gradual release approach. And of course, we want to provide plenty of opportunity for students to practice and use those vocabulary words in different settings, but also provide that time for increased language use. And in Spanish, but any language where you can make that connection to cognates, doing that as much as possible is really important to helping those students be successful. So taking a look in practice, again, you see it's very similar, utilizing a picture as well as the student-friendly definition, applying that word in a sentence. All those things are very similar. The key thing in supporting multilingual student success is the use of cognates. And then moving on to fluency in both English and Spanish, those strategies are the same. You want to start with a gradual release approach where you model fluent reading, you provide time for shared reading, maybe chorally in a group, and then most importantly, giving those students multiple opportunities to practice, whether it be paired reading, repeated readings, timed readings. For our multilingual students, this is critical in order to give them that time to practice and even work with a partner and talk about what they're reading. Doing these types of activities will also give them an opportunity to develop their comprehension, which is the last slide we're going to talk about. So again, for comprehension, the gradual release approach of I do, we do, you do is really important. Then the key thing here with our multilingual students is to think about how to support their translanguaging, which is basically providing them opportunities to access the material in their first language and how to go about doing that. We're going to go into the WIDA standards a little bit more and what those standards are based on, but providing students the opportunity to bring in members of the community, whether it be their family members or volunteers who might be able to translate. With technology, there's lots of opportunities for using technology to have family members translate text so that students can access the text first in their primary language and then have the opportunity to listen to it and read it and talk about it in English. Will provide them more opportunity for success with these texts. But also just choosing texts that are relevant to them and that they might have more of a background knowledge provides them more opportunity for success with their comprehension. And again, just a little bit about translanguaging, what it is. This text is a good visual to help you understand what exactly it is and how you can put it to use. So basically, it's just an opportunity of providing the student opportunities to access in their primary language, access text in their primary language, but even talk about it in their primary language, and then talking about it in English in order to not only process the text, but develop their understanding of their grammar, their language, as well as our grammar and language. So translanguaging not only develops comprehension, but their understanding and structure of the two languages. So, and why do we do it? Of course, it increases their comprehension and improves their understanding of language. So to sum up, English learners, as well as all of our students, of course, they benefit from the big five: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, reading comprehension. It's important that it's explicit and systematic, but for our English language learners, oral language and very explicit oral language instruction and support is key to their success. So because typical ELs are able to learn the sound symbol correspondences, if they learn the graphemes and the sounds through explicit and instruction, they still may struggle as readers without that oral language component, because when they're decoding words, when they come across words that they're sounding out, if their vocabulary is limited, they can't check for their understanding to be sure that they're right, or let alone support their comprehension, as well as struggling with tweaking those words that readers need to tweak in order to successfully sound out the word. And they also struggle with the syntax and the language in their primary language versus English. So all those things are critical to their success as a fluent reader. So PED has provided a framework that is kind of a good visual just to think about in supporting our English or multilingual learners. So when you look at this framework, it kind of gives you the idea that structured literacy is happening in all areas. Oral language development is happening in all areas. And if it's a dual language program, it's important that there's scientific evidence-based reading instruction in their first language. So really explicit instruction in all 5 areas in their first language as well as their second language. But if it's just ELD support that is being provided, explicit instruction is key to their success. So again, this is just another visual to let you know the importance of the word reading and the oral language comprehension for multilingual learners. Okay, and then I'll turn it over to Candace, and she's going to talk a little bit more about access and the WIDA standards.
Oh, now we get into the what now portion, right? So we know all this, we know how important it is to provide these opportunities for our multilingual learners. So how do we do that? What happens now? So first we want to start by looking at access, which is our current assessment here in the state of New Mexico for measuring language proficiency and development in our multilingual learners. It is given K-12, and important for us to know is that it's anchored in the WIDA standards, and that is what really guides our instruction for language learners. And we're going to delve more into how that guides instruction as well. But first we want to look at what is it actually that Access is measuring, and it is measuring these domains of language. So we need to remind ourselves that oral language development is integrated into the instruction that we provide. And literacy does not just mean reading. For our EL students, our multilingual learners, we need to make sure that we're providing opportunities in all domains of language. That means listening, reading, writing, and speaking. And for our students who are in dual language programs, that's the 4+1, because we have that +1 of the metalinguistic awareness, where we want students to really be thinking about how they use language, what languages they use, when do they use them, how do they bridge between language, when is it appropriate to use what languages, all these skills that they need outside of the classroom too, that we want them to be really aware of that and thinking about that. So we have to explicitly build in those opportunities into instruction. But when we're looking at access, this is what we're measuring. So here's an example of an access report that you might have already seen, and you can see how it breaks it down. And it looks at how we measure the different domains of language. And then here's the levels that we're measuring. So we just wanted to kind of bring your awareness to, well, what does it mean? A lot of times we might know that we have a student who's at a level 3, but what does that really mean? So here's a description of those different proficiency levels. We do want to draw your awareness to the idea that language is not really linear. We can't say that a student is going to go from a level 1 to a level 2 to a level 3. Language doesn't tend to progress in a linear fashion, but it does give us an idea of how students might progress in their language acquisition. We might see a student go from a level 1 to a level 4. That might happen, but we can't predict that. But this gives us a kind of a guide as to what it might look like. We also wanted to just draw your attention to this because what happens a lot of times is what we call, or what I used to call, the ice cream cone effect. And that's when we get students who come to us at this entering level. We have these emerging bilingual students who maybe don't have a whole lot of English proficiency. And so when they come into us, they're the top of that ice cream cone and they're melting. And we feel that, and we feel the urgency, and we feel the pressure. And so we throw all the supports and scaffolds at them right away. And we do everything we can to try and prevent that ice cream cone from melting. And then as we move down that cone into like the level 3 or level 4, oftentimes we forget that that cone was once melting. And our supports and our strategies kind of start trickling off. We oftentimes see these learners as very similar to their English speaking peers. And we forget some of the urgency and the targeted planning that we had for these learners, which also can bring us back to the point that somebody made earlier about how English language development and instruction actually can be a good thing for all of our students, right? Because if we see a developing student and we're comparing that and saying, oh, that's pretty much like my other student who's not a language learner, then we know that there's some language processing issues, some language acquisition issues maybe with that student too, right? So those effective strategies can help all of our students. And as we go down that ice cream cone, it doesn't mean, as we get narrower and narrower down that ice cream cone, it doesn't mean our support stops. It means that we get more targeted in the way that we provide that support, so that we don't end up with what we call LTELs, or our long-term English learners, who are identified when they come to us in kindergarten and don't exit services all the way through and maintain in their ELD services throughout high school. We want to prevent that from happening. So that brings us to, what is WIDA? WIDA is the guiding form that we use to provide this instruction. It provides a framework for us to be able to address all these issues and how we support our language learners and what we need to do to provide that explicit targeted instruction. I'm going to share with you a link to the WIDA standards framework. This is a new framework. It was updated in 2020. It's about 400 pages long, so I'm sure you have plenty of time and you're just dying to read through all 400 pages of that. Like I said, we can't get super detailed in that with you guys today because we just don't have the time, but we're going to do our best to go through it in a way with you that is digestible, and hopefully will get you inspired to look more into that framework. And then of course, Laura and I are always here, so you can reach out to us and we would love to continue planning and supporting this with you. So WIDA does have, like I said, it's the new ELD standards framework updated in 2020. And this is the framework that we use to guide our instruction with language learners. The basis for the framework is in 4 big ideas that we'd like to talk about with you. These are basically the guiding practices with which the framework was written. And so it's important that we understand these so that we are aware of what's driving instruction for our multilingual learners. And we start with their first big idea is that equity and opportunity of access for all of our students. And what this is really pushing for us to understand is that a lot of times we can tend to have some deficit-based thinking around our multilingual learners and say things like, well, they can't do that, or they're not able to do that. And it's really our job to provide those opportunities and access, build those bridges and scaffold for our students so they do have the same opportunities and the same access to curriculum and content and everything else that all of our other learners do. The next big idea is integration of content and language. And this is just the understanding that language development and acquisition doesn't happen in isolation. I've seen it happen a lot of times, like, especially as students get older, that like, well, that's the ELD teacher's job, and this is my job. And within this framework, we realize that no, it's not. It's really all of us working together, and language happens in any content that we teach. It's everywhere, and we have to be aware of it at all times, which really leads into the next big idea, which is that there should be collaboration among all stakeholders. All of us that work with these students are responsible for these students, and we're all here to support their language acquisition. So whether I'm the ELD teacher or the PE teacher or the librarian or the general ed classroom teacher, whatever it is, I still have a part to play in the language acquisition for that student. And the last big idea is that we're providing a functional approach to language development, which really means we want to provide our language learners with all the tools that they need to be successful. We want to make sure that we're providing instruction in a way that's going to allow them to approach language, not just with us in the classroom, but wherever they might be, they're going to have the right tools to use their language and throughout their lives.
The one thing on that too, Candace, I'll just jump in about the integration of language and content. Just the idea of making every effort to integrate, especially science and social studies, into the literacy content is helpful for students, but also the WIDA standards framework gives support to develop those oral language skills, and not only academic and social settings, but in the different content areas.
Thank you. So this is the framework in a nutshell. And what I like to call this is the nesting doll of language instruction, because really we start big and we move in and we focus in how do we target instruction. And the framework really moves us through how we do that. And so we start with what are called the ELD standard statements, which you're probably familiar with if you know the WIDA framework. This was in the old framework. So you've probably seen these standards before. We really like this graphic because it shows how that standard 1 is integrated into all the content standards as well. The big shift here in the new framework is that the language in these standards has changed. They used to be that used to say language of social and instructional purposes, language of language arts. That has now changed to language for. So this might seem like a really small shift, but actually it provides a big emphasis in the way that we understand these standards. So it's really showing us now that as we look at language for social and instructional purposes, or language for language arts, or any of these content areas, it's really showing us that we cannot access this content unless we have the language to be able to do that. So it is really an important shift. And that standard 1, that language for social and instructional purposes, is really tied into all those other standards because it's at the core of what we do. We can't access that content unless we know the language that's needed to interact with our teachers, to interact with our peers, to interact with our environment. So we can't get really content heavy unless we have that basic standard. I would like to caution with that, though, remember our ice cream cone. So we do want to focus on that standard and make sure that that's strong, but we don't want to get stuck. We want to make sure that we develop that language, and we're worried about that melting ice cream, but we don't get stuck and not move on to developing that more complex language too. And then we move on. So our next layer, or our next phase down in that nesting doll of language, is our key language uses. And these are the 4 areas of language that we use to guide the content. So these appear across all content areas. And so WIDA has said, well, if we focus on these aspects of language, it really helps us to organize and prioritize the way that we teach. So we will see, no matter what content we are teaching, we will see that we'll have to narrate, inform, explain, and argue. This is another big shift. This is new to the 2020 edition. The old key language uses were recount, explain, argue, and discuss. So we do see a shift in the type of language that we're using now. And the reason for that, again, is it's about that functional approach to language. What is going to be more appropriate to provide more functional language tools to students throughout all aspects of their life? So WIDA's idea is that these 4 key uses really help us to provide more functional instruction to our students. And then we move into language expectations. These are really tough. We could probably spend a whole day just doing a PD on language expectations, but we're going to do our best to make them understandable here and hopefully useful for us. So you might notice that this looks most similar to any other content standards that you've seen before. This is not actually a standard, a content standard, like a typical Common Core standard, but it does give us an approach to how to provide instruction for our students. So the language expectations really tell us, what do we want our students to do? And how do we get them there? Nestled into these language expectations, we see the functions and features of language. How does the language work within this expectation to help us know what students should be able to do? And so I'm going to share again, this is the WIDA framework has this broken down by grade level bands. So, if you don't have time, of course, who does, to pour through all 400 pages of that WIDA framework and find the grade level that you're working for, this other link that I just shared will have it broken down by the different grade level bands, so that you can go in and look for specifically what you need for the students that you're working with. And once you do get into there, you'll see some pages that look like this. And this is really laying out that whole nesting doll of language for us. So we start on top with our language standard. For our purposes here, we're talking about literacy. So we're going to be looking at the standard of language for language arts. And then we also get to see that what is the key language use we're working on, which in this case, we picked narrate because we're going to look at an example here in a little bit of how we put this all together for a student. And for that particular student, this is what we were working on. So we picked the key language use of narrate. And then within that, you'll see that we have our language expectations. What do we want our students to be able to do? And then under that now, we have the functions and features of language. So if I want my student to be able to construct language art narratives that orient audience to context, I can come down here to my functions and features. And this is really my planning phase for me. How am I going to get students to do that? I might be using pictures and descriptive title. I might be using expanded noun groups. It's going to give me all the guidelines for how I might approach instruction for that student. You will notice that we only have functions and features for expressive language. So something that's, I think I forgot to mention before, and it's key for us to remember, is that expressive language generally takes longer to develop than our receptive language does. And then also, it's really hard for us to measure how language is being interpreted by our students. That receptive language is not really easy for us to measure. Once we ask students to produce something like, tell me about the story that you read, or write a summary, we've now turned that into expressive language. So when we're looking at functions and features, we're really only going to see the expressive forms there. And I know this is a lot of information and it can seem really overwhelming. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can unmute and ask questions as we go along too.
And these are things that the student should be able to do. So that helps you with setting objectives for your students.
So then we've kind of narrowed our focus down, and this is our last stop here, is when in the middle of that nesting doll, we get to the proficiency level descriptors. Those of us that are familiar with WIDA will remember the can-do descriptors, the can-do statements. And this is kind of a shift. The can-do statements are still available, they are still up, but they do not align with the new key language uses. So they can be very helpful in how we plan instruction for our students. But the proficiency level descriptors are going to be aligned with those new key language uses. And they're going to do very similar to what the can-do descriptors did, is they're going to help us understand where our students are currently, that asset-based approach, what can they do, where are they, and where do we want them to be. And then these PLDs help us plan for how we get them to that next level of proficiency. And they help us measure those expressive language skills so that we know how to address student progress. So we'll take a look and kind of what these look like. Again, I'm in that grade level 2-3 band. And I'm looking at what the proficiency level descriptors for expressive language in there. You're going to notice that across the top, we see the different levels of language proficiency. That's like what we saw when we looked at the picture of the ice cream cone. You'll notice that these measure at the end of each level, because that's really what our goal is, right? That's what we're aiming for. We don't want to move from the end of level 2 to the beginning of level 3. We want to go from the end of level 2 to the end of level 3 and continue on. Just again, that reminder that language is not always linear. So that's going to be our, our best laid plan, is that we're moving through these levels, but we might see kids kind of ping-ponging along this continuum. And then along the left-hand column, you'll notice the criteria for language. And this really gets into the complexities of the way that we use language. So we start down on the bottom with that word phrase level. We move up into some sentences where we're getting a little bit more grammatically complex. And then we move into discourse, where we get a lot of that density of language, and this like more organized and conversational. I like to just draw attention to this because it reminds us that English language development is more than just teaching key vocabulary. I think a lot of times we kind of get in this mindset that in order to prepare our English language learners, we have to front load vocabulary. And it's not that that's not true, but if we only focus on that vocabulary instruction, we're missing all those other complex layers of language. And we kind of get stuck along that bottom line at the word phrase level. And we don't ever dig deeper into that complex language. Sorry, I lost my place. So now we're going to take a look at, well, what does this look like when we put it all together? How do we plan for instruction for our language learners where we can integrate all of these things, what we know about our learners, how we use the ELD framework, how we put structured literacy practices into place to support that. So first thing we have to do is start with data, just like with all of our instruction. We always want to look at data and make data-driven decisions. So we're coming back to that access report that we looked at earlier. And you'll notice on my screen now, I have my little buddies here in the corner telling us what's going to be expected of us here. And one of the domains we're going to be doing here is speaking. So I would like for you guys to tell me, and you can, I didn't put writing, but I guess we can share out in the chat too. I'd like you to unmute if you're comfortable with that, or you can share out in the chat. If you're looking at this access report, what do you notice about this student? Or what would you use on this report that might help you in starting to plan instruction?
Even start by strengths and weaknesses. What do you notice to be their strength? What do you see to be their highest area of need of support?
You can unmute or put in the chat.
Well, it looks like listening is a real strength. So that's something that you could use. And then an area of need is that, like you were saying, that expressive language, that oral language. Oh no, well, yeah. And speaking, am I reading this correctly?
So I think a lot of us are seeing that, that same thing. We're looking at listening is an area of strength, and we do always want to have that asset-based approach, right? Like, what can my student do? Where is their area of strength? And how do I use that to build on their area of need? So thank you all for sharing, and those that are putting in the chat too.
I noticed Kathy mentioned that as well, that listening is an area of strength and is easy to pair with speaking, which is a low domain. And Margot said vocabulary activities that include speaking and writing. Lots of good comments. Poetry
Typically,
and song.
Oh, sorry, Laura, I talked over you.
That's okay, go ahead.
So typically the way that I would encourage teachers to read this report is to look first for that, right? What is that area that I really need to address? Of course, we want to look at all domain areas, but where, in order to start my planning, what am I going to teach? The area of need. And I typically say, don't look at those overall scores. Are they important? Yeah, we want to know overall where our student is, but that's like saying in terms of structured literacy, that's like saying, oh, your student needs to work on reading comprehension. That is so all encompassing. There's no way to really target a skill within that. So those overall scores, they could be good at a glance, but we really do want to look at what is the targeted skill that we're going to be addressing.
And Laura,
sorry,
can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can you go back to that previous slide?
Absolutely.
So is this what we would see?
There we go.
Is this what we would see on the access testing? Is this what that would look like?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
So the drawback, oh, sorry, go ahead, Trish.
Well, and I was just going to say, what's the difference between those listening, speaking, reading, and writing, those colored shaded areas or domains, compared to the oral reading, literacy, comprehension overall? Because like oral language
just
to
gonna
me
jump
is
in
like,
on- Yeah, go ahead, Trish.
well, just like to me, oral language is like speaking, it's that expressive language. So just help me understand the difference between those items, if you would, if you could.
Yeah, it is. And that's like what Candace was saying. There's kind of no use in using like oral language because they use or their listening skill and their speaking, their listening score and their speaking score to make an oral language score. So if you really want to dig into oral language, you want to look at what their listening score was and their speaking score. So, and then literacy is made up of reading and writing, and comprehension is 70% of reading and 30% of listening. So they took those 4 major domains and they combined them to make those overarching. Yeah.
It's an aha moment. Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
seeing it now. Thank you.
So, and when you get a report, it will show you that too. And it shows you exactly how they calculate the scores. We do have a rare percentage of learners who take an alternate access due to maybe having a disability, and their score sheets look completely different. We did not bring that in here because that's going to be a small percentage of our learners. But if you ever do see those reports and have questions about them, you can always reach out to us and we can talk through those reports too. But yeah, we do want to really focus on specific domain areas. So these towards the bottom of the report, you're seeing more broad scores. Also, the drawback to access is that we only get it once a year, right? And I think most districts start their access testing around February. So by the time you get your report, it might be the end of the year. So then really you're talking about how are we planning instruction next year for these kiddos, right? So we do, and that kind of leads us into what I was coming into with the next slide, is we do have to look at other forms of data, right? We can't just have one data sample that is going to provide everything we need for understanding our students. So in this case, we're looking at a student who is a 2nd grade student. That's why I was looking at the grade 2-3 bands before, who is currently working on, or at the time that this data was pulled, was working on a unit in literacy about character development, character traits, how characters develop over time, that kind of thing. And, so we're going to bring in everything we know. What is the student working on? What do we know about this student? What are the students' language proficiency scores? What are their iStation scores? What about classroom observations? Everything we know about the student is really going to go into how we plan for that student. But we kind of wanted to throw this out to you guys again too and see, well, what do you think if we had these 2 pieces of data? We've already identified that speaking is an area of need. I know we don't know everything about this student because we're just looking at 2 snapshots here, but what do we notice? What do we notice about this kiddo? What might that mean as far as implications for instruction? And again, hopefully you can share out or you can put in the chat.
Hi, it's Christina here. I'm thinking
Christina.
about the correlations of the phonemic awareness and alphabetic decoding with the vocabulary and the speaking. So thinking about, as we're wanting them to speak, to use English and to build that capacity, looking at those iStation scores that are showing that those are areas of need for the student, and how that speaking correlates with the phonemic awareness, the alphabetic decoding, and the vocabulary in speaking English.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm seeing a lot of the same kind of information coming through the chat, because what we really have to think of, and again, I know you guys don't know everything about this student, but what we have to think of is how do we target really that speaking skill? If I'm only working on phonemic awareness or only working on alphabetic decoding, I'm seeing kind of that alphabetic decoding, I'm seeing that sharp decline, right? And then, for me, I kind of went, ooh, vocabulary, because vocabulary, again, I'm seeing that's an area I really need to target, and I know that that's going to correlate with speaking. So that might be a great place where I tie in the support for this student. Again, we don't want to get stuck on vocabulary instruction is all that we need to provide for our ELD learners, right? But with this student, and especially considering I'm in a unit where she's going to need to talk about character traits, then for this student, it might be really appropriate to focus on that vocabulary. Vivian, I see your hand up if you wanted to share.
Thank you. I think it's all of this is like good information, and you definitely see a pattern. One is influencing the other with the iStation and phonemic awareness and alphabetic decoding. But one thing that I would just caution is that, you know, for our purposes, the reports are working, but if I'm working with a teacher, it's 2 data points. So this is a good starting place, but making sure to keep track of those data points, because you see that trend line where it's going down. But if that second data point is off a little bit, or if the next month it increases, then that line kind of shifts. So again, you know, I'm not saying don't use this at all. Don't wait until you have 3 data points, but just, you know, keep that in mind that it's a starting place and just keeping track of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely want to, and I would say, you know, for the purposes of what we're doing here, this is the data that we had to share with you guys, but I would say we always want more than just 2 things too, right? Whether I'm including parent input, whether I have informal classroom assessments that I'm giving, progress monitoring assessments, CBMs, whatever it might be, I want more information, right? And Laura, I think you were going to add to that.
Well, I think that was just a really good point. Using multiple assessments and of course, teacher observation. We all know our students. So absolutely, Vivian, that's a really good point. And then if I could also answer Ada's question. She said the question she gets most often is, when do we focus on these specific skills during integrated ELD or designated ELD time block? That's a really good question. And Candace, we'll see if you agree with me, but I would recommend, because typically the guidance is to use that ELD time for language development. And so that's a good time to work on oral language development. And then the phonemic awareness and phonics piece, I would integrate that into my small group time in my literacy block.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it depends, you know, there's a lot of things that could go into that, and maybe Ada, we can have more conversations about that, but different classrooms, different schools have different approaches. And so it depends on, you know, I used to do pull out ELD services. So I was a designated ELD teacher. So during a designated time, I was going to do these things. But when I was a general ed classroom teacher, I was doing integrated ELD throughout the day. So it can really depend on what our approach to instruction is. And then again, it ties us back into what do we know about this student and the rest of the instruction that they're receiving. So I was saying I would probably focus on vocabulary to help support that speaking goal. I would probably do that during a designated ELD time, because I know that I have Heggerty and foundations happening at other times that's going to support that phonemic awareness and alphabetic decoding. Is it still supporting my language acquisition goals? Yeah, those things are, because I'm still going to have language production happening with my student during those times. But for this specific goal, I probably have a designated time that I'm working with the student on. I'm not sure if that makes a whole lot of sense, but hopefully it's just as clear as mud. So for this specific student, we went and made an actual plan for instruction. So all the way back at the beginning, I said something about this is kind of like how we would write an IEP, right? We want individualized goals for our language learners. So we walked through knowing what we know about the student, how would we set up a plan of instruction for the student? And we're going to go through that nesting doll of language to get to that plan. So for our purposes, we're looking at language for language arts, which is how we start with our ELD statement. We're going to look at that key language use of narrate. Where did I come up with that? because that's what's in alignment with the benchmark unit that she's in, working on narratives and having to discuss character traits. Then I'm pulling that language expectation, my next layer there, of constructing language arts narratives that orient an audience to a context. And in case we don't remember what that looks like, that came from here. So again, my overall standard, my key language use. I'm going to look at expressive forms of language because that's what I'm measuring, speaking. I'm going to want her to construct language art narratives that orient audience to context. And then I'm looking at how do I want to do that? So here again, like Laura was telling us, this is what we want our students to be able to do. So how am I going to get her to orient her audience to context? How am I going to get her to get me to understand what she knows about characters, right? For her, I'm going to focus on expanded noun groups to introduce characters. Again, that's what's in alignment with my other instruction. So that's what's going to work for her goals and everything else that we're doing. And then I move into my PLDs, my proficiency level descriptors, and I look at what do I know about my student? Where is she right now? Does anybody remember what level she was in speaking? She was a level 2 or 2.2. So I'm going to look at level 2. That's where she is right now. At least that's what my language proficiency data is telling me, which means I want her to get to that end of level 3. So then this is how I can make a plan for her. For me to know that I'm being successful in that language instruction for her, I'm going to want to see her using a growing number of types of elaboration. So we have put together a template that we can use to help with this kind of planning. My understanding is you will have access to these slides. I think they'll be shared out once we're done with this presentation. So that is a live link in there for you, and you can get access to this template. Just please, if you're going to use it, make a copy because I don't think I put that setting on it. So we might all be typing in the same place if you don't make a copy first. But we're going to walk through how we would use this this template to plan. So we're going to call our student Daisy Duck, and we're going to take a look at what her goal looks like. So I would go back to my language proficiency data. I knew that listening was her strong area. Speaking, she was at that 2.2. So that's where I'm going to be addressing instruction for her. And then I can kind of fill in, and this is where I start tying in those structured literacy practices too. And I start looking at how am I going to support that? How this is my plan for instruction for her. Since I know that speaking is going to be the area that I'm addressing for her, I'm going to use Flipgrid so that she can do speaking practice on there. I find this to be really effective for our multilingual learners because it's very low stakes. They can make many errors, they can try again, they can use visuals to help them. So I would assign her Flipgrids, where I would want her answering questions about the characters using growing number of types of elaboration. I'm going to set that goal of 100% accuracy within 8 weeks of time. And then I'm going to go through and figure out, well, what are the explicit or what are the structured literacy practices that I'm using to help support that goal? And for me, I'm going to do explicit instruction of articles, adjectives, modifiers. I might use graphic organizers to help support that. Laura was talking about a really good sentence builder thing that she had, we could show different sentence structures to help with that. We might use like the juicy sentence template to build into how we put sentences together. Where do those articles go? And because I'm developing that vocabulary along with this as well, I might do like a shades of meaning activity so that I can have her start understanding the complexity of the words that she's using. And then we thought it's also very important that students are involved in this goal setting. So there is an area on this goal setting sheet where students would provide their input. And they would give a response as to what are things that they can do when they're not with you, when they're not in class with their teachers, that can help with this language development. So if I'm wanting her to add these modifiers to make her description or to describe characters and to make them more descriptive, I might have her, she might say something to me like, I'm going to go home and talk to my parents about my day. And, I'm going to explain it using as many adjectives as I can, or I'm going to talk about my pets to my brothers and sisters. And then a lot of times I used to do this with my students, and a lot of times their response to me, well, when I would say, well, what are you going to do? And they'll be like, I'm going to do my homework. So, we might have homework that helps and supports them with that. But if their homework is not aligned to that goal, then it might not always be what we want it to be. And then, of course, like with any goal we set, we have to have some progress monitoring happening, right? How do we evaluate this goal and our progress toward the goal? We might use things like iStation or whatever monthly progress monitoring measures we have, quarterly assessments. A lot of times with a goal, an expressive goal like speaking, we don't have an assessment that measures that other than access, and access only happens once a year. So that's not going to necessarily be effective for us. So we've got to come up with other things. So in this case for Daisy, I would use the Flipgrids that I'm assigning to her, and I would have one that is specific for assessment purposes. So for the sake of time, I know I'm running through that kind of fast, but these templates will be available to you. You'll be able to look at them more in depth if you want to. And then if you have questions, we can always be here for help and support with that too. Okay, I guess it's okay. And then Laura, back over to you.
All right, so I know that was a lot of information and it was fast and furious, but to sum it up, in order to truly support our multilingual students, it's just important that we support both major domains equally and simultaneously. So using those structured literacy practices, as well as using the resources available through us through WIDA and those extra access scores to support our students, we can hopefully build literate multilingual students. So the last thing I want to cover is scheduling. We talked about it a little bit, but especially in a dual language program, but even in any classroom supporting multilingual students, PED encourages that every effort be made to integrate content instruction with literacy and reading instruction, not only for the sake of time, but in order to strengthen students' oral language development. So the last thing we want to share are some resources that we have for you. I also made a Padlet.
I can talk while you're finding that if you want, Laura. So Laura
That's
put
okay.
together a Padlet that she's going to share out with you that has all of these resources in them. But what we used in kind of driving our presentation today was, of course, the WIDA framework, which you have the link to in there. And then the resources by grade level bands, which you also got the link to in the chat. We do recommend the 6 Shifts website or the book Shifting the Balance, because both of those really help to align our understanding of traditional ELD practices and how we can kind of shift those understandings into structured literacy practices and what we know is most effective for our students. We also recommend Dr. Eugenia Mora Flores and Dr. Jose Medina. They're both leading researchers in the fields of bilingualism, biliteracy, and ELD instruction. I know that Dr. Mora Flores and Dr. Jose Medina are currently contracted with Albuquerque Public Schools. So they do have trainings that are, if you happen to be within Albuquerque Public Schools or coaching in Albuquerque Public Schools, they do have trainings that should be open for you to be able to attend. If not, you can find them online too. Lots of resources on there. And then we did also include for you Dr. Shiroki Hawley's Orange Workbook, which is a book of culturally and linguistically responsive teaching and learning practices. We did want to try and model some of that here for you guys, like in terms of the waterfall activity that we did, in terms of having our visuals out for you. We do want to be as supportive of the idea that we have to balance all of this, right? We have to integrate all of these practices, and it's not about adding something else onto your plate. It's about how do we manage this all together and make it most effective. So there are some good ideas and strategies within that book by Dr. Hawley that can help with some of these things too. And then last,
Oh, yeah, for some reason it's not showing up on the slide, but we'll make sure to have it for the coaches session if you want it. And all the resources are on that, and Jamie's gonna help me with it. So
yeah, and
Jamie McCracken will help me with it, and we can maybe get it ready by then.
Thank you. And I did forget to mention too that Laura and I are gonna start having some kind of like open office hours, so that if you do have questions or concerns as you're working on some of these things, if you would like to dig into the WIDA framework more, and really study the implications for supporting language learners, we'll have times that you can come and meet with us. We don't know exactly right now when that will be, but we'll get that information to you as soon as we have it all planned out.
Along with that, in the template will be a lesson planning page for backwards planning if you want it, as well as there's Common Core and Espanol. And so it kind of takes a look side by side at what students are doing in Spanish and English, even for those foundational skills. So that's also helpful for Spanish speakers. And again, for our Native American speakers, because it's more oral, the best thing you can do is just support as many things, allow them opportunities to hear things in their native language, rely on community, family to support you in that. If you have students in the same class that speak the same language, set aside time for them to speak together. And just those next steps, reflect on planning practice and supporting teachers in this. What sources of information about multilingual children learning development do you have, including those home language supports? And focus on what they can do and leverage that to support them in their learning. And just to be intentional about addressing equity in language in your planning to support these students. Have as many resources and books available to them that are supportive of their culture and their language acquisition. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time. I guess we'll come back together at 2:15. The coaches will come back together to discuss this a little bit more. Thank you, Kendall, for hosting the meeting and monitoring time. And thank you, Jamie McCracken, for helping with monitoring the chat. We'll see you guys